Have you ever wondered why older car interfaces always seem to have been designed in a vacuum? How does the accidental UI we use every day shape the way we live our lives? And what happens if we take a couple of UX laws, apply them to better understand how these designs could have been better? So in this video, I wanted to do something a little different, which is analyzing old UI, or UI that's obsolete and hasn't been around for a while. In my case, it's an interface I interact with on a daily basis, and I'm sure you do too. It's the very interface in our car. And what I find fascinating about this is that all of us interact with sort of accidental interfaces, things that we have to put up with because there is no other choice. In our case, we drive a 2016 Renault Captur, and the car's touch interface dashboard was probably designed around the same time, or maybe even before that. I use this interface every day, and it got me thinking this is an interesting case study to look at how we can apply certain UX principles to better understand why certain designs or user experiences aren't working the best they could, and how to improve on them. A lot of us designers can't help but notice certain things and how they work in the world and ask ourselves questions like, could this be improved on? Or does everyone know how to use this? Is the copywriting clear enough? All these questions are really important because they help us as designers to not only sharpen our skills, but continue to ask questions of, is this really serving the person using this product, or is it making it harder for them to do that? So as I thought about this idea of analyzing my car UI dashboard, I got reminded of this phrase that's often said to especially junior designers, which is, you are not the user. You as the designer shouldn't assume that you know what the user wants or what the user will do. And I think while that's valid, I think when you're working on products that have very specific audiences, and in general, yeah, we shouldn't assume that we're the user. For this case, I really wanted to go the opposite route because I am the user here. I am the person driving our car, and I am the person who is interfacing with this touchscreen on a daily basis. So with that in mind, I'll be using the Laws of UX by John Jablonski to guide us in how we can take a couple of these very well-known principles and to directly apply them with my frustrations and problems and opinions on my car dashboard. I always ask myself, why does my car dashboard look like it was designed in 2006 for a Samsung cell phone? So looking at the dashboard of the Renault, you can see there are plenty of paradigms that it borrows from the visual language that was very prevalent during that era. It's actually quite interesting because the Renault that we have is from 2016, but the interface looks like it's over a decade older. But anyway, while I was looking at this, I kept wondering, and I Googled a couple of times, cell phone interfaces 2006, or cell phone UI 2006, cell phone Samsung 2006, and I kept getting like very mixed results. I couldn't figure out, is there even a categorization of this style, and what is that called? While I was thinking about this, my cousin Tim, not to be confused with cousin Stan from the last video, mentioned this term Frutiger arrow. And I thought to myself, wait a second, what is this Frutiger arrow? And he sent a link over, and immediately a wall of images popped up showing exactly what I had been thinking about in the past couple of days. And while I won't really pretend to understand this visual language that well, I do know that it evoked a feeling of connection of that time when it comes to design. And that made me ask the question, a lot of times we as software designers pour our efforts into hopefully making the best things we can for the people that use the products that we design. But oftentimes, the software that we make never stays the same that we designed it to be. Software isn't something like a painting or a song. Software changes with time, with every single update, with every single tweak. So software sometimes, to my mind, feels a bit like the ship of Theseus. You keep changing the boards, and at one point, it's not anymore the original thing you designed. Now that's both the beauty and also the downside of designing digital products. If you look at this example of a car dashboard, I still use the interface every day, right? And so the decisions of that person or team still matter to me. And so it's a good reminder that as we work on the products that we work on, to focus on the fact that yes, at the end of the day, software design is fleeting in a sense. The things that we make won't last forever. But at the same time, in that moment of someone using something, we can make a difference in how they feel, and hopefully we can make them do the job they're trying to do better, and also make them get a positive feeling from interacting with technology. And with that, let's jump into the car dashboard UI, starting with principle number 1, the Pareto Principle. For many events, roughly 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. So let's see how that actually looks like in practice and if the Renault is doing a good job of that. So we're looking at the car dashboard. This is effectively the home screen. Every time you start the car, you see these options. Now, right off the bat, there's a couple of things that might be making sense, but I want you to focus your attention on the bottom right corner and that plus button. So if you're driving a car, what do you think would happen if you press that plus button? You probably are thinking this might be some kind of a more menu, right? So when you tap that, I presume you'd imagine that there's probably some more contextual controls that would relate to things you want to do starting from the home page, right? So what I found very strange was when I discovered this plus button, there's a certain option right at the top called Change Language. And when you press that, it takes you to menu to change the entire interface's language to a different one. So let's look at the Pareto Principle and think about that again. For many events, roughly 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. In simpler terms, what this is getting at is that a smaller number of inputs or actions are going to have a much bigger impact on the overall experience or outcome that a user is trying to achieve. So if you think about it in the context of the car interface, when you're driving, your attention should be on the road. Even if you're stopped, you want to have easy access to the most important controls that are relevant to you. So in the case of cars, you can think of a lot of use cases that make sense, right? Navigation or music are probably the most common, for example. In an interface like this, you want to make sure you surface relevant and contextual controls. And so this plus button does make sense. It's hiding maybe secondary actions, but changing your language is something you might do once, if at all. So this is a perfect example of what not to do, especially when you're dealing with such important pages like the home screen. Changing your language is not relevant, and putting it as the topmost item in a secondary navigation is really to no one's benefit. Even if you look at the second option, change homepage, that's arguably also not so important. A lot of times people like to change their home screens and customize things, but it's usually a set it and forget it thing until later they decide that maybe they want to change it, which ties nicely into not necessarily UX law from this list, but a design principle proposed by Jakob, which talks about the importance of thinking about customization when designing any kind of system. Customization is quite an important thing, especially when we think about all the modern ways we interact with our devices today. You think about your iPhone or any kind of other mobile device. If anything, they become more and more customizable over the years. Now, whether you agree with this or not is a different topic, but we are seeing a shift in customizability being something that's expected rather than not. And so now let's take a look at how this looks like in practice on the Renault. And this is a perfect example of opinionated design going into a totally wrong direction, which doesn't help the users, nor does it really do what it effectively is setting out to do. So let's go ahead and push that button of change homepage. So here you'll see 4 radio buttons, effectively giving you 4 different layouts you can pick from. Now what's crazy about this is, number one, why did they pick 4 options as opposed to any other set of numbers? And secondly, why is the layout that they picked the only layout I can choose from? If you go back to the home page, you'll see that there's 2 main sections that are most prominent on the screen. For me, that's a section related to audio and one related to maps. I don't use the built-in map system, so this maps card I've had to look at for the last 5 years because it's not offered in any of the 4 layouts proposed by the Renault's interface. So this to me is a prime example of thinking ahead about what users might want and giving them enough flexibility if you're implementing the possibility of customizing the homepage. And I think it's your responsibility to make sure that that serves the user rather than this in between. If you aren't going to offer customization, that's also a legitimate choice, but you have to then be aware of making the homepage as accessible as possible for the user to get to the most useful features that might be used. But in this case, it doesn't hit the mark, and it's a great example of just introducing friction when there doesn't have to be. All right, on to the next principle, which is Jacob's Law. Users spend most of their time on other sites. This means that users prefer your site to work the same way as all the other sites they already know. Speaking of Jakob, this is actually his principle, and it's one that's very relevant to anything we design today. If you think about any device or software that someone uses, the reason they can so easily flip between different apps or websites is because most of those apps and websites follow very similar design patterns. And what Jakob is getting at here is that we need to understand that users expect the same design patterns as the ones they're used to. If we see the Renault dashboard, they're actually doing something that is quite right in a sense according to this principle. At this time, people were kind of used to those interfaces. So kind of looking at this law, one thing that's always been a pet peeve of mine is that if we're looking at the homepage and you'll see this block that I don't want to be there regarding maps since I don't use the internal navigation, every day I look at it, it's always shouting me, telling me, no maps found. with an exclamation point. And this is kind of a good example when we look at copywriting in UI design. No maps found with an exclamation point is not great copywriting because it's creating a sense of urgency or a sense that you did something wrong, when if we look back at the earlier principles, I don't want that to be there in the first place. But moreover, it has more to do with the fact that copywriting should follow some conventions that people are used to. Today we see, for instance, copywriting being a lot more casual and friendly and conversational than it's ever been in the past. Even for professional or enterprise tools, the language used that people expect should often be reassuring and on the side of the user rather than on the side of the system. And in this case, the system is shouting at me when really all I want for that block is to be gone. All right, day 2 shooting, different t-shirt, probably different background. Let's do the next principle. All right, so this one's called the Doherty Threshold. Hopefully I'm pronouncing it right. And it goes like this. Productivity soars when a computer and its user interact at a pace, less than 400 milliseconds, that ensures that neither has to wait on the other. So let's take a look at a few other details from this principle. Use perceived performance to improve response time and reduce the perception of waiting. Animation is one way to visually engage people while loading or processing is happening in the background. Even though there's a few components to this principle, I wanted to focus more on this idea of snappiness or responsiveness, especially when it comes to interacting with a system or interface. A lot of times what makes the difference between an app that feels unresponsive or clunky and an app that feels fluid and smooth and a joy to use often comes down to how animations and responsiveness is implemented. There's a lot of ways to deal with this in terms of how you design a product itself, from handling micro interactions to deciding which are the best design patterns to use or in utilizing certain paradigms. Wait time and responsiveness between states is critical, I think. And a lot of times software gets this wrong, resulting in apps feeling slow. What we see often in human psychology is that the quality of the user's overall experience is tied to how these small interactions add up. So whenever you have time to make something feel quicker, users often respond better to it. A great example was I once listened to an interview with the CEO of Instagram a long time ago, and he actually said something really fascinating with how they actually gained traction with the early version of Instagram. And what it had to do with was them basically faking the load time by pre-uploading images before you yourself made the conscious decision to upload a certain image. So in turn, what happened was, at the time, mobile data speeds were quite slow, and Instagram managed to use a very clever UX trick and make people ask the question, how did they actually make this faster than competing products? That's one example how to work around certain technical limitations. But in the case of the Renault, I wanted to highlight how superfluous animations can really make you feel like the interface is much slower than it actually is. Every time you tap on any navigational item, be it a button to take you to the next menu or a submenu, there seems to be this need for the interface to create this wow effect of taking you through space and time to get you to the next spot. You see these decorative lines morphing and changing, the menu items fade in and fade out. A lot of these animations can be good when used sparingly, but by and large, users never want the interface to feel sluggish, especially in the context of driving your car and changing things on the fly. So this is a great area to focus on because it's very important to remember that people want to get to their things as fast as possible. And sometimes I think designers get a bit of tunnel vision, which might have been the case with the Renault, where the designers wanted to make sure that the transitions look cool and are exciting, but subsequently forgetting that people don't care about looking at animations. People just want the interactions to feel quick and responsive. Now there's obviously a sweet spot here because we know that if we omit animations and transitions, that detracts in the overall experience the user has, because then the interface feels unfinished, it feels old, it feels like no care is taken into making things feel cohesive. So there's definitely a middle ground that we look for here, and I think this principle kind of nails that by describing that less than 400 milliseconds is generally a good rule of thumb. Obviously they want to tweak these numbers and every transition is different, but ultimately you want to keep this number low so the user feels like they're getting to where they're supposed to go. Sometimes I also feel like with transitions, we aren't really aware of how important it is to embed this responsiveness in all the interactive elements that we provide in an interface. I'd highly recommend a presentation done by one of the designers at Apple who was responsible for creating the brand new interface after the iPhone dropped the physical home button and switched to a completely software-based solution. What's really cool about this presentation is you see how much care went into all the interactive states when opening and closing apps, which sounds very ridiculous, but when you look at it in context, a lot of these principles we've seen adopted throughout interfaces either on the web or on mobile devices. For example, one thing that was mind-blowing to me, and one of the reasons why I always loved when Apple implemented this approach, is when you're opening an app, for instance, there should always be the ability for someone to stop that action mid-transition. The reason why that is important is because it adds to the stack of micro interactions that add up to the whole experience of something feeling responsive. So if you open an app, there's a high chance you probably won't stop that action. But because you have that ability, you can swipe that app back into its place, that ability really makes the app feel like it's listening to you, while ultimately making you feel like you're in control of the things you're interacting with. Overall, I think this is something worth focusing on and something that the Renault didn't do a great job here. Whether it was from hardware limitations or simply poor design decisions, it's something that's definitely annoyed me over the years. Cool, let's jump into a couple more principles, the next one being the Stroop Effect. The mental dissonance caused when we attempt to make sense of two conflicting attributes at once. And here's the more detailed explanation. Reaction time is delayed when our minds attempt to process information that contradicts our understanding, e.g., a green sky, purple grass, a red lemon, a blue apple. So while this might sound a bit abstract, I think it ties really well into how we utilize certain things that we take for granted. In this case, let's look at the application of color in the Renault's dashboard. So if we look at the customization page with those famous 4 layouts that I was talking about earlier, I'd like you to focus your attention on the specific colors that they chose for each of these groupings. So maps, they decided to go with red, the audio grouping is blue, and the eco grouping is green. So while you might be thinking, whatever, these are just colors that they picked that look nice, this is where I think the Stroop effect comes into play, because we're accustomed to associating certain colors, especially in interfaces, with certain meanings. So if you think about the classic notification component, you'll oftentimes see the typical association of green meaning success, yellow meaning warning, and red meaning error. These colors are very much baked into everything we use today, and oftentimes straying from that just for aesthetic reasons can lead to confusion and also misunderstandings. Now, while the home screen might not be the best example of this being overtly problematic, I still think it does show you how important it is to stick to conventions when trying to associate meaning with color. Whenever I open the home screen, I still always ask myself, why exactly is the maps red? Be it whether the map is loaded or isn't loaded. In my case, it's always going to be red. So a simple solution here would be, for instance, to pick a neutral color that can be applied to any type of component in the case of the home screen. Let's take, for example, if they did apply the solution that I mentioned earlier, where the user could customize their home page to pick any block they wanted. Well, in that case, they're going to run out of colors very fast. So ultimately, this was kind of an arbitrary choice, which I think isn't always the most helpful in these instances. And the reason why these color choices are random is because all these blocks have the same hierarchical value. The maps component has the same value as the music component as the eco component. They aren't necessarily more or less important because they're all accessible via the home screen. And that's something I noticed we can glean from the Stroop effect. And with that, let's finish with the final principle, the classic mental model. An explanation of someone's thought process about how something works in the real world. Match designs to the user's existing mental models. This enables them to easily transfer their knowledge from one product or experience to another, without the need to first take the time to understand how the new system works. So mental models, as we know in UX design, are extremely important because they help users best understand how your product or feature works. A lot of times when we look at products that don't work so well, it's because it's not matching users' existing mental models. So with the Renault, I wanted to look at an example that has to do a little bit more with recognition versus recall, which again is another Jakob Nielsen heuristic principle, but it also ties nicely into this idea of matching users' mental models. So there's a settings page in the Renault that has to do with how you want your display to react at certain times of day. At the top of the screen, you'll see daytime brightness and nighttime brightness. Now, both of these make perfect sense, right? As a user, you don't really need any preconceived notions about this mental model, since you can assume that in the day, this is going to be the brightness, and at night, you'll pick a different brightness. Now, what's missing here, obviously, is the understanding of when exactly night mode kicks in. If you look at some other interfaces, for instance, from Apple, when it comes to their night shift mode, you'll see they have 2 options. They have one at sunset, which is a lot more specific than at nighttime, and 2 is you can pick exactly when that happens. But what I really want to focus on is this option called Use Night Mode. Now, this is a really problematic option because it relies on the user understanding what exactly night mode is. And in this interface, there is absolutely no explanation as to what this does. You can take it on, but you don't know what that means. Could it be perhaps that night mode is using the nighttime brightness setting? And if that's the case, why isn't it labeled use nighttime brightness? The difference in terms just adds confusion. But even if we assume that's the case, that using night mode means using the nighttime brightness, if you select use night mode and also select switch to night mode when dark, wouldn't that effectively make your screen always in dark mode? This is a perfect example, I think, of not providing contextual information as to what a setting does. Now, Apple isn't always the best at this, but I think they have really set a good paradigm in terms of how to improve the communication of what a specific setting does, especially if the user isn't familiar with a term or a feature. I'm sure you've seen this many times when you open the Settings app in your iPhone. Certain settings, for instance, have this contextual explanation below it to help you understand what happens if you toggle that on or off. I find this very important because a lot of times, coming back to that first quote I mentioned, that you are not the user, we can sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that because we've worked on this product for so long and we know these internal labels for certain names or features or modes, that the user will just know what that means. But it's not the case. We can't assume that the user will know. So what we have to do is, whenever we notice that something is going to be a little bit out of scope as to what people are used to using, we need to specify what that means. So in this case, the Renault could have said either use nighttime brightness, or it could have specified below the option what exactly happens when you turn on this setting. However, this setting again is very confusing. This whole settings panel could have been reworked to better accommodate what the user wants to do and what the options are available. For example, in this case, there could have been really two settings, right? Auto or manual. And if you select auto, then it would automatically adjust the brightness between daytime and nighttime. Alternatively, if you hit manual, you could then adjust exactly what your brightness is that would stay consistently the same. Overall here, it's important to note that we don't want to make the user recall certain labels we've introduced like night mode. Rather, we should at least explain what those terms mean, or find solutions that omit using custom labels entirely, having the user intuitively select options based on their actual needs in this case. A good rule of thumb to always come back to is Steve Krug's saying, "Don't make me think." Alright, so we've reached the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed that. That was kind of my take on my experience using our Renault car dashboard, and hopefully you've learned a couple of things from how we can improve interfaces and in which way we can critique existing things that we use every day to become better designers. I want to take a moment to thank all of you guys who've watched my previous video about the plugins. The nice comments I received have been super encouraging, and I'm really happy that it resonated with so many of you. The whole goal of me starting this channel is to share things I've learned in the world of product design, and hopefully to find some intersection with other things I find interesting. So really big thanks to you guys watching and supporting me. Being a full-time data designer means that I can't really publish videos that often, but I'll do my best to continue making videos as I find this really fun. I'm really happy to interact with you guys, and hopefully we'll be able to make topics that are interesting to you. If you do like the videos I'm making, feel free to subscribe and like and share around. That would mean a lot to me, but if not, that's totally fine too. Again, appreciate it, and thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.